Pelican Bay State Prison sits in the remote northern corner of California, surrounded by forests and fog. From above, it looks like a fortress, steel, concrete, and razor wire sealed off from the world. But inside those walls, another world exists, one governed not by the state, but by the rules of organized crime. For decades, Pelican Bay has been the heart of California's war against its most violent inmates, and yet it has also become the command center for the most dangerous prison gangs in America. Among them, none were more feared than the Aryan Brotherhood. Born in the 1960s as a white supremacist protection group, the Brotherhood evolved into an organized criminal empire that thrived on violence, loyalty, and silence. Every member knew the code: never cooperate with authorities, never betray the Brotherhood, and always follow orders. Violating that code was a death sentence. Inside Pelican Bay, where the gang's top leadership was housed, the Brotherhood's rules were enforced through intimidation and blood. Even in isolation, their reach extended across cell blocks, prisons, and states. By 1998, Duke Kimberly Bolter was already a veteran of this world. He had spent years navigating the violent politics of California's prison yards, earning his place as a trusted enforcer within the Aryan Brotherhood. Bolter's name was whispered with caution by inmates and guards alike. He was not reckless, not loud. He was deliberate, disciplined, and utterly loyal. His reputation as a shot caller gave him authority, and in the world of Pelican Bay, that meant he could command or carry out the Brotherhood's most serious orders. Bolter had already been convicted of first-degree murder in the late 1980s. But for him, prison was not the end. It was the beginning of a second life, one defined by allegiance to the Brotherhood. Within the cells of Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, the SHU, men like Bolter held power invisible to the outside world. Messages, called kites, traveled between cells on bits of paper hidden in laundry bags, legal mail, or even body cavities. Each one carried coded instructions that could mean the difference between life and death. It was in this world that another inmate, William Stanton Boyd, found himself trapped. Boyd had once been part of the same system of silence and violence, but by early 1998, he had made a decision that set him apart from everyone around him. Boyd agreed to testify for the prosecution in a case against a Pelican Bay correctional officer named Jose Ramon Garcia. Garcia had been accused of using his position to orchestrate attacks on inmates, using gang members as weapons to settle personal vendettas inside the prison. Boyd's decision to testify was a dangerous one. Inside Pelican Bay, cooperation with authorities was viewed as the ultimate betrayal. Informants didn't survive long. Word of his cooperation spread quickly through the prison's underground communication network. The Brotherhood's intelligence structure, built on observation, manipulation, and control, ensured that every act of disobedience was noticed. When they learned Boyd was preparing to testify, it wasn't a question of if he would die, but when. For Bolter, orders like this were not personal. They were part of the system, assignments that reinforced the Brotherhood's authority. To them, Boyd wasn't a man. He was a message. Killing him would remind every inmate that no one, not even those in protective custody, could escape the Brotherhood's reach. The decision to act would have come quietly, delivered through coded language, possibly even through a chain of intermediaries who never directly spoke to each other. Each man in the chain knew only what he needed to know, ensuring loyalty and secrecy. The reality of Pelican Bay made such an order easy to execute. The prison was designed for control, but in practice it gave gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood a perfect environment for organization. Inmates were isolated for 22 hours a day, but those hours were filled with plotting, strategy, and the silent maintenance of power. Guards often looked the other way, unwilling or afraid to interfere. Some were complicit. In an environment where violence was constant and trust was non-existent, it was easy for one more death to disappear into the statistics of daily brutality. Outside the walls, Boyd's cooperation was seen as a glimmer of justice, a chance to expose corruption inside Pelican Bay. But inside, it was a violation of an unspoken contract. He was preparing to break the code of silence that the Brotherhood and other gangs depended on. The news that he was testifying against Garcia, a prison guard with his own network of allies, made him a marked man from both sides. On the surface, it might have seemed like a simple conflict between inmates, but what was brewing beneath was something far larger. A collision between a corrupt system of power and an underground network that had mastered violence as a form of communication. For Duke Kimberly Bolter, the path forward was clear. The Brotherhood had issued an order, and orders were not questioned. To maintain status, to survive, and to honor the code, Bolter would do what was expected of him. In Pelican Bay, loyalty was proven not through words, but through blood. The stage was set for one of the most chilling murders in the prison's history. A man marked as a rat would soon face the Brotherhood's justice. And Duke Bolter, a lifer with nothing left to lose, was about to carry out a killing that would echo far beyond the walls of Pelican Bay. In Pelican Bay, information moved like smoke through the vents, impossible to trace but always spreading. When William Stanton Boyd agreed to testify against Officer Jose Ramon Garcia, his decision traveled through the prison faster than any official report. Within days, the Aryan Brotherhood knew. Within hours, the order went out. The term was simple, cold, and absolute. Green light. To anyone who lived by prison law, those words meant death. Inside the Brotherhood, discipline and obedience replaced hesitation. There were no debates, no questions about morality or justice. A man marked as a rat had to be silenced. Failure to act would invite suspicion. And in the Brotherhood, suspicion could be fatal. Boyd's name, once just another inmate on the roster, was now a symbol of betrayal. Killing him would restore order. Duke Kimberly Bolter understood what was being asked of him. He was already serving life for murder, his future bound to the concrete walls of Pelican Bay. To the outside world, he was a forgotten man. To the Brotherhood, he was still valuable, a soldier capable of delivering a message the gang needed to send. Bolter's reputation as a shot caller made him the natural choice. He didn't need promises of reward or protection. His loyalty was its own currency, his violence its own proof of faith. March 9th, 1998 began like any other day in the security housing unit. The corridors were sterile and silent, the air thick with tension. Every move was monitored. Every sound echoed off the concrete. Yet beneath the surface of this controlled environment, something deadly was already in motion. Guards called out names and cell numbers, authorizing brief moments of movement, showers, recreation, or cleaning. Within these windows of access, the Brotherhood found its opportunities. Boyd was scheduled for limited movement that morning. He would be taken out of his cell, escorted along a corridor to another section of the unit. It was routine, predictable, and fatally exposed. Witnesses later described how quickly it happened. One inmate saw Bolter approach, his steps measured, his eyes fixed. In his hand was a weapon no longer than a pen, a sharpened piece of metal wrapped in cloth, known among inmates as a bone crusher. There were no warnings, no words exchanged. Bolter moved with purpose, stabbing Boyd multiple times before guards could react. In the confined space of the corridor, Boyd barely had time to defend himself. The attack lasted seconds. By the time officers rushed in, it was already over. Boyd collapsed, bleeding heavily from deep puncture wounds. The shank had found its mark again and again, guided by years of experience in a world where violence was methodical, not impulsive. As the alarm blared and inmates hit the ground, Bolter stood over his victim, calm and expressionless. There was no struggle to escape, no sign of panic. To him, the job was done. The Brotherhood's order had been carried out. Guards restrained him, dragging him away, but Bolter didn't resist. Inside Pelican Bay, the act spoke louder than any words could. Everyone watching, guards, inmates, even those who pretended not to see, understood exactly what had just happened. The investigation began immediately, but the code of silence was unbreakable. Prison officials questioned dozens of inmates, but most claimed to have seen nothing. Others offered conflicting stories designed to confuse and delay. It was as if the entire facility had agreed to erase the moment from existence. Only one inmate, whose conscience or fear outweighed his loyalty, eventually spoke up. He testified that he saw Bolter stab Boyd and later heard other prisoners whispering that it was because Boyd was a rat. That single testimony would become the foundation of the case against Bolter. Prosecutors relied on it to piece together the narrative of a gang-ordered execution. They argued that Bolter's actions were not spontaneous, but calculated. A hit authorized by the Aryan Brotherhood to punish Boyd for cooperating with authorities. Even in the absence of physical evidence linking the gang directly to the killing, the motive was unmistakable. Boyd's death sent shockwaves through the prison system. For inmates, it was a grim reminder that no one could defy the Brotherhood and live. For the authorities, it exposed how powerless they were to stop the gang's operations, even inside the state's highest security facility. Pelican Bay's SHU was supposed to isolate leaders from their networks, but the killing proved the opposite. Orders still flowed freely through the walls, as if the concrete itself carried the messages. Bolter's attack also reignited fears among prison officials about the deep connections between gangs and corrupt staff. The fact that Boyd had been preparing to testify against a guard suggested that the lines between criminal and authority had blurred. If a prisoner could be silenced so easily before testifying, what did that say about control inside Pelican Bay? In the weeks following the murder, the prison went into lockdown. Cell searches intensified, communication was cut off, and known Brotherhood members were interrogated. But the gang adapted as it always had, silent, efficient, untouchable. They didn't need to respond or explain. Boyd was dead. Their point had been made. Duke Bolter, meanwhile, was placed in isolation, his name added to the list of confirmed Aryan Brotherhood enforcers. But inside those walls, his reputation grew. Among his peers, he wasn't viewed as a criminal. He was respected, even admired. In the twisted hierarchy of prison honor, killing a rat was the highest proof of loyalty. It was an act that ensured Bolter's standing in the gang for life, regardless of what happened in court. The official reports would later describe Boyd's murder as an act of retribution, the result of one inmate's choice to defy the Brotherhood's code. But those who lived within the prison system knew the truth. It wasn't about revenge. It was about order. The Brotherhood had preserved its authority through fear, just as it always had. And Bolter, a man who had already lost everything to the system, had once again proven his worth through blood. Boyd's body was carried out of Pelican Bay under tight guard, but his death marked more than the end of a life. It was the beginning of an investigation that would reach into the darkest corners of the California prison system, where gang power, corruption, and silence converged. What began as one man's decision to tell the truth would soon unravel a web of hidden alliances between guards and gang leaders. And at the center of that web stood Duke Kimberly Bolter, the man who had turned an order into an execution. When William Stanton Boyd was murdered, his death didn't just silence a witness. It ignited a scandal that would ripple through California's prison system. The killing was not the work of a random act of rage. It was an execution that touched the boundaries between organized crime and state authority. The man Boyd was about to testify against, correctional officer Jose Ramon Garcia, represented something even darker than gang violence. He symbolized the corruption that had taken root within the very system meant to enforce order. The Garcia case had already drawn attention from investigators long before Boyd's murder. Garcia was accused of using his power as a guard to orchestrate attacks on inmates he disliked. Through influence and manipulation, he allegedly coordinated with gang members to carry out his vendettas, using prison politics as a weapon. For years, whispers had circulated among inmates that certain guards were playing both sides, turning a blind eye to gang activities in exchange for silence or control. Boyd's decision to testify against Garcia threatened to expose it all. He wasn't just a cooperating witness. He was a liability to the entire network of unspoken deals that maintained a fragile balance of power inside Pelican Bay. When Boyd died, the prosecution's case against Garcia almost collapsed. It was as if a vital piece of evidence had been wiped from existence. Yet, ironically, the murder drew more attention to Garcia's conduct. The very act of silencing Boyd made his story impossible to ignore. Investigators dug deeper, and what they found confirmed Boyd's claims. Garcia had, in fact, been conspiring with certain inmates to have others assaulted. The revelations painted a grim picture of Pelican Bay, a place where gang leaders and corrupt officers operated under the same code of fear and convenience. While Garcia's case moved through the courts, Bolter's own fate was being sealed. The state had little doubt about his guilt. Witness statements, gang intelligence, and the circumstances surrounding the attack all pointed to a calculated killing. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder and added a special circumstance: the murder of a witness in retaliation for testimony. That designation carried the harshest possible sentence under California law: life without the possibility of parole. During the trial, the courtroom atmosphere was tense. Bolter, calm and unflinching, sat quietly as prosecutors described the Aryan Brotherhood's methods, its hierarchy, its enforcement system, and its reputation for eliminating informants. To the jury, Bolter wasn't just an individual. He was part of a machine built for control and death. The defense countered that the evidence was circumstantial, that inmate testimony was unreliable, and that no direct link to the Brotherhood's leadership had been proven. But the details were too precise, the motive too clear. The pattern of intimidation and execution within the prison left little room for doubt. The testimony of the single inmate witness became the prosecution's key weapon. He described how Bolter approached Boyd, the sudden violence, and the whispers that followed. Though his credibility was attacked, his account aligned perfectly with what investigators already suspected. Coupled with the evidence of Bolter's long-standing affiliation with the Aryan Brotherhood, it was enough. The jury found Bolter guilty of first-degree murder, with the special circumstance of retaliating against a witness. For the state, it was a a symbolic blow against one of the most violent prison gangs in the country. But the truth was far more complex. Inside Pelican Bay, the Brotherhood barely flinched. One member's conviction meant little to a network that thrived on sacrifice and silence. Bolter's imprisonment, even his life sentence, only added to his credibility within the gang. He had done what few dared to do: carry out a sanctioned execution for the Brotherhood's cause. In 2001, Bolter's name resurfaced in appellate court documents. His defense argued that the murder charge was overstated, that Boyd had not yet testified, and therefore the special circumstance of witness retaliation should not apply. The appeal sought to redefine the timing of justice, suggesting that intent wasn't enough without action. But the court rejected that logic. The judges ruled that the evidence of motive and the clear link to Boyd's planned testimony were sufficient to uphold the special circumstance. Bolter's life sentence was affirmed, sealing his fate within the system he had once ruled from the shadows. The case also forced the California Department of Corrections to confront its own failures. The murder had happened in one of the most secure prisons in the nation, under the watch of guards who were supposed to prevent exactly that kind of violence. Investigations into staff corruption expanded, and Garcia's eventual conviction confirmed what many insiders had long suspected: that Pelican Bay's control system was deeply compromised. Guards and gang members alike manipulated the flow of power, each using the other to survive in a place where survival was everything. Outside the prison, Boyd's death was reduced to a legal footnote, a brief mention in court records and appeals. But for those inside, it carried a far more personal meaning. It was a warning that no man, regardless of courage or conviction, could defy the Brotherhood's reach. Bolter's act reaffirmed the old rule: talk to the authorities, and you die. Still, the state refused to let the symbolism fade. Prosecutors highlighted the case as an example of their ongoing war against prison gangs. Journalists who covered the story described Pelican Bay as a battlefield, one where the lines between justice and survival were blurred. They noted how the very design of the prison, meant to suppress communication, had instead concentrated the power of those most committed to control. The walls of isolation had become the Brotherhood's fortress, and Bolter's crime was proof of how effectively that fortress still operated. Even after his conviction, investigators tried to map the network of influence behind Boyd's murder. Who gave the order? How did the information travel through layers of isolation and lockdown? The answers never fully emerged. The Aryan Brotherhood structure ensured deniability at every level. Orders were filtered through coded messages and trusted intermediaries, leaving no traceable line of communication. Bolter never confessed. He never named names, never explained his actions. He didn't need to. Inside the gang, silence was the final act of loyalty. His refusal to cooperate, even when facing life without parole, preserved his standing within the Brotherhood and completed the circle of obedience that defined his life. In the end, justice was served only in part. The state had its conviction, the files were closed, and the system returned to its uneasy balance. But the deeper truth remained unresolved. Boyd's murder revealed a world within Pelican Bay that law enforcement could never fully control. The Brotherhood still operated, still commanded fear, and still treated the prison not as a cage, but as its kingdom. As the years passed, the memory of Boyd's killing faded from headlines, but within the California Department of Corrections, it lingered as a reminder of just how easily power can shift behind bars. For every man like Boyd who dared to speak, there was another like Bolter waiting in the shadows, ready to enforce silence with steel. The message was clear. The Brotherhood was eternal, and betrayal would always be met with death. By the time his final appeal was denied, Duke Kimberly Bolter had disappeared into the labyrinth of the California prison system, a man whose name lived on only in court records and whispers among inmates. He was now one of countless lifers serving out their sentences in the dim solitude of the state's most fortified institutions. Yet for those who knew the story, Bolter's legacy wasn't defined by the crimes written in his file, but by what he represented: the unbroken power of the Aryan Brotherhood inside the walls of Pelican Bay. To understand Bolter's world is to understand a system that thrives on fear, loyalty, and hierarchy. The Aryan Brotherhood, known simply as the AB, was not a disorganized band of racist inmates. It was a criminal syndicate, one of the most structured and ruthless organizations to ever operate behind bars. Every member was bound by a blood oath that demanded silence and obedience above all else. Betrayal was answered with death, hesitation with punishment, and disloyalty with elimination. The gang's creed was simple: live for the Brotherhood, die for the Brotherhood. Bolter had embodied those rules long before Boyd's murder. To the AB, he was a soldier who had proved his loyalty through action, not words. Within that violent code, he had achieved a twisted kind of respect. Killing Boyd was not viewed as cruelty. It was seen as discipline. It reinforced the gang's control over the prison and ensured that no one dared to challenge its authority. In a world where respect was currency, Bolter had earned his in blood. Inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit, men like Bolter operated in near-total isolation. Each inmate was locked in a small concrete cell for 22 hours a day, with only a slit of sky visible through reinforced glass. Meals came through metal slots. Communication was supposed to be impossible. Yet the Brotherhood adapted. They developed invisible systems of contact. Tiny messages slipped through cracks, coded letters disguised as legal correspondence, and intricate smuggling networks that linked cell to cell. Inmates communicated through plumbing pipes, by tapping Morse-like codes into walls, or even through corrupt staff willing to carry messages. The Brotherhood's reach extended far beyond the SHU. Orders from isolated cells at Pelican Bay could spark violence hundreds of miles away in Folsom, San Quentin, or even federal penitentiaries out of state. Inmates who owed allegiance to the AB acted on these orders without question. The entire system functioned like a military chain of command, where each man's duty was clear and unquestioned. Bolter's hit on Boyd was one of many such acts, a reminder that the gang's control didn't weaken in confinement. It strengthened. Outside the prison, public perception of the Aryan Brotherhood often focused on its white supremacist ideology, but inside, its real motivation was power and profit. The gang controlled drug distribution, gambling, and protection rackets. They forged alliances with other prison factions when it suited their goals, setting aside racial divisions in the name of business. The AB's authority came not from numbers. They were vastly outnumbered by rival groups, but from fear. A single member could enforce the will of the gang because everyone knew the consequences of defiance. For Bolter, that fear had become both his weapon and his prison. As years passed, the world outside continued without him. Inside, he remained a symbol of what the Brotherhood demanded and rewarded: unquestioning obedience. He was confined, but his name carried weight in a place where names meant survival. Among inmates, stories about Bolter circulated like folklore. They said he moved silently, struck without hesitation, and never looked back. Whether those stories were exaggerated didn't matter. In prison culture, Myth was as powerful as truth. The murder of William Stanton Boyd continued to haunt the California Department of Corrections. It revealed a truth that no one wanted to admit, that gangs, not guards, still controlled much of the day-to-day reality inside maximum security facilities. The state responded with new restrictions, tighter isolation measures, surveillance, and the eventual dismantling of Pelican Bay's SHU as it was known. Yet even as reforms came, the Brotherhood adapted again. Decentralized and secretive, its influence spread through smaller, less detectable cells across the system. Bolter's generation of leaders had set a model that newer recruits continued to follow. Boyd's death also stood as a symbol of the cost of speaking out. He had chosen to tell the truth about corruption, believing that justice could prevail even inside a place as dark as Pelican Bay. Instead, his cooperation sealed his fate. His story became a warning to others, proof that the Brotherhood's justice was faster and more final than the state's. Every inmate who thought about testifying, every man who considered defying the gang, remembered what happened to Boyd. His murder had achieved its purpose. For Bolter, there was no redemption, no change of heart, no dramatic end. He remained in custody, serving multiple life sentences in a system that both created and contained him. He never spoke publicly, never granted interviews, never sought forgiveness. Silence, after all, was the foundation of his life. His refusal to talk, even when it could have earned him small privileges or leniency, was his final act of loyalty to the Brotherhood. To the gang, that silence was sacred. In the years since his conviction, investigators and journalists have continued to study cases like Bolter's as part of a broader effort to understand organized prison violence. What they found was chilling. Despite isolation, despite surveillance, the Brotherhood continued to function like a shadow government within the prisons. The murder of one man, ordered in a whisper, executed in seconds, could change the behavior of hundreds. It was a control rooted not in numbers, but in psychological dominance. The legacy of Duke Kimberly Bolter is inseparable from the institution that shaped him. Pelican Bay was designed to contain the most dangerous men in the state, yet it became the very environment that allowed them to thrive. The system that created the security housing unit also created the conditions for the Brotherhood's survival, a place where men with nothing left to lose could find purpose in loyalty and power in violence. Today, Bolter remains an obscure figure, his story buried under years of court filings and forgotten headlines. But inside the prison system, his name still holds weight. He is remembered not for who he was, but for what he did, for enforcing the unspoken law that has governed America's prisons for decades. Betrayal must be answered with blood. The story of Duke Bolter and William Stanton Boyd is not just a tale of crime and punishment. It is a window into a world where justice is distorted, where silence is survival, and where power operates in the shadows. For every man like Boyd who dares to speak, there is another like Bolter ready to silence him. And as long as that balance exists, the cycle of fear and violence will continue behind the razor wire of America's prisons. In Pelican Bay, every word carries weight, every act has consequence, and every betrayal has a price. Boyd paid with his life. Bolter paid with his soul. And the Brotherhood, as always, remained untouched, its creed unbroken, its silence unchallenged, its power as cold and enduring as the concrete walls that still hold its soldiers.